by officials, and at least from our perspective, this compromises voter secrecy in these cases within the context of the Somaliland voting system. And this was, of course, regardless, conducted in an open and highly transparent manner, which is commendable with the agreements of all the party agents. Stations were generally accessible, and there were instances of assistance by private citizens or by the security forces. Most polling stations closed at 1800 hours, although a number of them allowed those already present in the queues to vote, and the generally slow pace of voting, about between 20 to 30 votes being cast per hour, meant that voting continued in one case as witnessed until 8 o'clock in the evening. The security of voting was laborious and time-consuming, but it was very thorough. Vote counting, too, was generally quite slow, and this, I think, Mr. Chairman, reflected the often very tired state of a number of the officials who had worked an extraordinarily long day, often in quite difficult conditions, hot and uncomfortable conditions, and by the time of the late evening, of course, quite dark conditions with minimal lighting. COVID-19 was not particularly well observed. There was very little in the way of social distancing, but we did note that officials were issued with face masks as well. In terms of the general observations, and this is perhaps the meat of our observations overall, this is the 8th democratic election in Somaliland and serves to strengthen its democratic tradition in a region not known for its democratic character. This should be recognized by the world, we maintain, and especially supported by Africa. Voting was generally peaceful, characterized by high levels of trust and enthusiasm from the electorate, which assisted in overcoming any frailties in election management. The conduct of the election illustrates overall for our members the existence of an effective state governed by its own unique form of social contract. The National Electoral Commission, from our perspective, effectively administered a complex and logistically demanding election, but there is scope for improvements according to its own regulations and laws. We can always get better at our job, and we will be coming up in a matter of time after we've allowed some of these issues to digest and, of course, the results to come out with some recommendations for the government and the NEC. There was largely consensus on disputes inside the polling stations. In Somaliland, and this is a general comment, the software appears to work exceptionally well, despite the often rudimentary conditions and widespread poverty that we saw. And this centers on the trust in society and the implicit confidence within the NEC. The hardware, which often people in the West are very concerned about, the hardware in these circumstances is a secondary tool and consideration. Local civil society was admirably represented, though dependent on the qualities of the local observers. SONSAF, in particular, we would single out as a cost-effective means for donors to support democracy in action. The Somaliland proportional representation system is complex, especially for illiterate voters, but the lack of a winner-takes-all system makes for a political environment where loss does not mean dramatic ethnic and other exclusion from power and economic opportunity. And we understand the context and the evolution of this system within Somaliland's own character. The calm that characterized the process The lack of party rancor on the day not only demonstrates people's implicit confidence in the process, but that Somaliland has used its own permutation of a modern democratic model to manage inter-clan cleavages. Allowing 15-year-old voters, and I had to think about this a little bit, Mr. Chairman, my youngest child is 15 years old. Allowing 15-year-old voters is a striking feature of Somaliland's democracy, but may assist in empowering a sense of responsibility and assist as well, including a critical and large demographic. The country has built on peace based organically on social consensus from the bottom up and developed a stable political environment centered around democratic participation, which contains tensions and mediates conflict through democratic choice. This was particularly noteworthy from our perspective, again, during these elections. The three political parties contesting the election appear to share a view that there's democratic progress. Although conditions, as I've already indicated, were somewhat rudimentary in cases, a can-do, consensus-based approach by all political parties and officials quickly resolved problems on the day to the satisfaction of all. On election day, there was a prominent presence of security officials who were preoccupied with managing queues, which threatened in some cases to become disruptive in some locations. No security force interference with voting in any polling station was, however, observed. The election, as I've already said, was observed by 2 international missions and a large independent domestic NGO, which deployed over 900 monitors to polling stations. The level of cooperation with the NEC, which cooperated and shared information freely with us, is commendable and, at least from the perspective of this mission, highly appreciated. International monitors, such as we were, and observers, appeared to be welcomed everywhere we went and even honoured in some polling stations. And it was indeed a great honour to participate in these elections as such an observer or monitor. And then finally, Mr. Chairman, and perhaps most importantly, from what the Brenthurst Foundation's mission saw during its period and scope of observation, the 31st of May 2021 Somaliland election process was free, fair, and credible. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to take them. If the journalists present have any questions. Otherwise, I'll ask the chairman to say a few words. You have a question?
Mentioned that you were able to basically list in some cases your capital city to have 250 units.
250 countrywide.
Countrywide, okay, put together. So how do you place them side by side, given the fact that the democratic process, any election having election anyway. Age limit really matters. That's number one question. And then you said that biometrics, that the biometrics voter verification works in some areas, and also there are some polling units that did not use biometrics. How do you justify this in view of the credibility of the elections? Then the involvement of the security in the casting of ballots. So, what's your overview of this?
Well, let me tackle your first question, if I may, on the specific setup of the Somaliland elections. We are not here to make comment on how Somaliland runs itself. We're not here to suggest modifications to its laws, and there's good reason for it to have a 15-year-old limit in terms of its voters. So I would leave that to the chairman to comment on. It is a striking feature of Somaliland's democratic setup, but it's one that appears to work for Somaliland. And if it works for you, then I guess that's exactly, in this case Somaliland, that's exactly why it's done so. On biometrics, this was largely an offline election. This was a manual election. As you know, there were challenges with the biometric iris system, and I understand that these will be put in place and these recommendations will be put in place for the next election. But the manual system, given the relatively low number of people per polling station, was effective. Sometimes what we saw, there were challenges between people who had formal ID cards and those, I'm being attacked by a fly, a particularly persistent one, people who had formal ID cards and those who had blue temporary ID cards.